reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity. This is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent. Hello everybody and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host Cora. Thank you so very much for joining me. You are extremely welcome here as always. It is wonderful to see you. Grab yourself a cup of tea. Cup of tea this morning. Cup of tea. It's a Wednesday morning. I haven't got a cup of coffee, but it is decaf. So, hey, that's a good thing. Hey, it's great to see you. Let's talk about gender diversity. And this time, every time we come together, we talk about, we take a confident declaration often made by a public figure or politician, in this case, made by a scientist, a sexologist, and we're going to take their confidently declared statements for the questions we hope they were intended to be. And we're going to take a look at the literature to see if we can't find an answer. Now, this one, it took me a while to do the research for this one. Listen, I just couldn't read too much at once of this literature. It was it's so depressing. It is just so awful to read that it took me a bit of a time. But hey, maybe that will make for an interesting podcast episode. I totally regret this one. I regret that this was the topic that I chose. I did this to myself. Took a while to read through it. I think we've got to a good conclusion. Honestly, you be the judge. But this time, we're going to take a look at a statement made by Michael Bailey. Now, I'm not totally sure that Michael Bailey would describe himself as a sexologist, but he's an American psychologist, behavioral geneticist, and professor at Northwestern University. But he also wrote the book The Man Who Would Be Queen, which is one of the most controversial texts in the community. It's super controversial, reviewing the very famous Ray Blanchard's work on autogynephilia, which is the topic of today. I can't believe I chose this one. Autogynephilia, we will come to it, but here is American psychologist Michael Bailey.
Autogynephilia is an inversion of an external sexual attraction. So these are men attracted to women, but for some poorly understood reason, they have this inversion of the female object inside themselves. They are attracted to the woman that they create inside themselves. Mm-hmm. If that attraction is complete, then they are unable to be attracted to anybody on the outside, and they will say they're asexual. They say, I'm not attracted to other people, but they're very sexually attracted to the woman they create inside themselves. Mm-hmm. So if a transsexual, a male to female transsexual, is so attractive that even men find her alluring, then some of these transsexuals find that very arousing, and they fantasize about having sex with men as women, and they also are attracted to women. They identify as bisexual. Mm-hmm. So that explains the non-homosexual, but I think it's just easiest to call those three subtypes, heterosexual, bisexual, and asexual, all autogynephilic transsexuals.
Many thanks to Michael Bailey for such an interesting question, posed as they often are in the form of some pretty confident declaration. And hey, we'll take it for the question that we know is intended to be, and we'll see if we can't find an answer together. So, are transgender women so damn sexy that they cannot resist but transition? Is that what the question is? Wait, no, okay, good. We could do this better. Autogynephilia, then. So, there's a few things we need to say before we get into the literature. The first thing is that this literature is dire. There's not a lot of it, and there's a lot of commentary papers all commenting on a handful of really key studies that are drawn forward to kind of evidence this stuff. There is a sort of a small field of modern literature that I think is good for us to look at. But before we do that, we're going to have to look at the kind of these original papers, and they are dire. Some of the stuff that goes into this is just horrendous. The theory itself is pretty bad, and we are going to be talking about sex. Apologies in advance, or a content warning. We're talking about sex, and we are going to be talking about autogynephilia, which is the idea that someone can become the object of their own sexual arousal, essentially, right? That's fundamentally it. That the theory goes that transgender women, and this is the other point, is that transgender guys are basically excluded from this literature completely. Like there's just no reference to trans guys in this literature at all. It's not really, I mean, in a sense, that's quite a critique of the literature, in that it really it is aiming to explain trans women's experience again, as we keep finding. But it just completely excludes trans guys. So for trans women, then the idea goes that there are two groups of trans women: those who are attracted to men exclusively, and those who are attracted to everybody else, basically on Blanchard's own kind of criteria early on. The idea that trans women can be attracted to women, they can be attracted to, they can be bisexual, can be attracted to both men and women. They can obviously be a bunch of other things too, like pansexual, or ace, or there's a bunch of different sexualities out there that trans women can be, but those were kind of lumped into one group for Blanchard. And Blanchard's idea was that there were fundamentally two groups: people who were attracted to men, who were kind of more typically transsexual, right? Who had kind of early feminine interests and were basically feminine identified, and as part of that were attracted to men. And then there's a bunch of other trans women who are not attracted to men, and who are therefore trans because they have an inverted kind of object of their sexual attraction, that they were attracted to women, and then they became attracted to the idea of themselves as women, as a sort of paraphilia, a sort of a pathological form of sexuality. Now, I'm not supporting any of this idea, by the way. Just kind of gonna put it out there. This was the theory, right? This is the theory. In some circles, continues to be a theory that sort of exists. So the notion was that, transgender women who were not attracted to men had a kind of inversion of their sexual, the object of their sexual desire. So they sort of inverted it. They became attracted to them, the idea of themselves as a woman, and then developed a kind of gender dysphoria from that inversion of sexual attraction. So that's the theory. That's fundamentally what autogynephilia is as an idea. And I find this affronting, as does a lot of the trans community, and honestly, pretty deeply offensive. And the reason is because, apart from anything else, it's fundamentally invalidating of trans identities, right? It says, oh, you're not really like a girl on the inside. What you are is a man with a sort of pathological sexual attraction, which is obviously invalidating in the most fundamental sense. But also because it's such a theory that's been designed without trans people in the room, because trans people in the room, generally speaking, I don't think would see it this way. I tell you a story. Don't worry, we're not going to get explicit. It's not that kind of story. I was out with friends a good few years ago, and we went to a bar in Winchester. We went to a club in Winchester, and we were dancing the night away. It was amazing fun. We had so much fun, and we did this classic thing that Kaz and I love to do when we go out dancing, and that's to dance in deliberately stupid ways, like to dance in ways which are hey, we're both a bit introvert. And to counter our introversion, we dance in wild dance moves that nobody would ever think of, right? The kind of dance moves that would cause people to cringe, except we go so wholesale into that dance move that people join in and love it. And we met this guy out when we were out, and I gotta say, I don't find a lot of men attractive, but this guy was dark and broody in the best way. He had this dark hair and these gorgeous eyes, and he was just like very broody, and I was like, counter to my own best thinking, right? This is not the kind of person that with any normal kind of perception on my part would I find attractive, and yet some deep part of me found him attractive. I don't know why to this day. But we went out, and so people were joining in with the dance, as they love to do, like we're doing wild, weird dance moves, and people were joining in. And this guy was having a great time too, and we were dancing with him, and it was so much fun. It was so funny, and we were all just in floods of laughter and having a great time. And then outside, at the end of that, we on our way to another bar, although I was, I had MS, so I was sort of thinking, this is probably about as much as I can do. I probably will call it a night. And so before the other guys went on to the next club, this guy, I was outside with him, and he was like, that was awesome. That was so much fun. And then he stopped. He was like, I just wondered whether, maybe before you called it a night, whether I could maybe ask for a kiss. And I was like, whoa, what? What did you just say to me? On the inside, my heart kind of sang a little bit. But here's the thing, right? In that moment, trans women out there, trans dudes probably too, in that moment, there's a sort of profound vulnerability. Like, I didn't know him very well, and I hadn't told him I was trans. And, the risk, the extraordinary, palpable risk that he might clock me as trans in the middle of kissing me was just too high. Like, it's not a fear that I should have, and it's not a fear that I know it's a bad fear to have, but it just is. Like, it just is. I was just scared. So I said no. I mean, I would have said no anyway, because I am married, but but listen, I was tempted. I can't tell you, but I said no, not only because I'm married and generally speaking attracted to women, but I said no. There was no small part of me that said no because I just desperately didn't want him to clock that I was trans. I don't know how he would, whether, a sound would escape my lips that would just be lower in register than I had anticipated. I can't even begin to fathom the level of risk. And maybe he wouldn't have minded. Maybe he would have found that okay. And that thought kind of makes me feel so happy. But I can't bank on it. I can't move through the world like that, because people have died in these circumstances. Like, people have been assaulted in those circumstances, and it's too frightening. So the idea that, autogynephilia, that transgender women find themselves so sexually arousing that they have to transition, is so a misunderstanding of the experience of being trans as to have only ever been designed by someone who was not. Because I can't tell you, and trans experiences are diverse, right? Super diverse. I'm not going to say that people don't experience themselves to be arousing. Like, I will get into the literature in a second, but I gotta say, it's just not my experience. I gotta say, my experience is quite the opposite. That sex and sexuality is actually pretty scary, because it's actually pretty dangerous for people in my position. And the other side of this, of course, is the idea that we would find ourselves attractive is so just, it's such a misunderstanding of that side of things too. Like, the amount of work that I put in to try to feel okay about myself, to try to see myself as a girl at all, right? Like, to get my external self to match how I see myself on the inside, to get my brain to categorize me as girl in the mirror, or when I hear my voice, as I have the going to be listening back. I listen back to the podcast episodes every time I record before I release them. And every time, hey, I don't find my voice the sexiest thing in the world. Maybe I should. Maybe I should find it deeply sexy. Maybe I don't know if that made it better or worse. But I don't. And it's the same with my visual appearance. Like, I wear makeup, I get my hair done, I try to do a lot of work, to try to feel at least okay about myself. Much less do I feel like, wow, hey, look in the mirror and be like, hey, you're hot. It's a rare thing that happens. I'm telling you. So autogynephilia. How did it happen? How did we get to this point where Ray Blanchard has a serious theory that transgender women find themselves so attractive that they have to transition? That's what provokes their gender dysphoria. For sure. How did that happen? What is the research? And what does the modern research say? The original research comes from a handful of studies from Ray Blanchard himself and his colleagues. And it's really interesting to read that work. There's a couple of big ones. One from 1985, Social Desirability Response Set and the Systemic Distortion in the Self-Report of Adult Male Gender Patients. Adult male gender patients. He means trans women. Blanchard, you. And in 1987, more importantly, heterosexual and homosexual gender dysphoria. Now, this one is the key one, really. So Blanchard and colleagues took 72 trans guys and 125 trans girls. Now, forgive me in advance, when you're reading this literature, it does get a bit confusing because obviously Blanchard refers to the trans guys as female and the trans girls as male consistently. So if I make a mistake in my referencing this literature, deepest apologies in advance. It's just like it's a labyrinthine cognitive task to try and work your way around trying to convert Blanchard's language into better, more inclusive language. It's one of the reasons why reading this literature is so taxing, because constantly them referring to people like you as male is pretty galling. So what Blanchard and his colleagues basically did was to take all of these participants and categorize them into autogynephilic versus non-autogynephilic. So anybody who showed any essentially like attraction to themselves as the opposite gender, sexual attraction to themselves when thinking about themselves as the opposite gender to the one that they were assigned at birth. And he took anybody who showed any kind of sexual arousal in that context from self-report. He took them to be kind of autogynephilic, and he took a look at the distinction. And he found, essentially, to his mind, he basically found that 82.2% of transgender women attracted to women, people he called heterosexual males, hence the labyrinthine cognitive task, were classified as fetishistic. So transgender women who were attracted to women, 82.2% of them were considered fetishistic, i.e. autogynephilic, compared to 9.6% of transgender women who were attracted to men. And they found that none of the transgender guys had that kind of autogynephilia. So they obviously found this to be statistically significant. They were like, listen, this is evidence to suggest that the good proportion of, and in Blanchard's own kind of theory, all of the transgender women who are not attracted to men are autogynephilic, and that was the source of their gender dysphoria. And this study went on to be referenced in all kinds of work across the next 30 years, essentially, nearly 40 years now. And it's amazing to see that it keeps finding its way into modern literature in both directions. Like Lawrence 2017 and in her book, they're referencing heavily autogynephilia from the original work, and Julia Serrano from 2020 in a critical review looking back, still referencing the same early studies, particularly this one. This one is one of the big ones, I think, that keeps getting referenced. And of course, off the back of this study, and there have been other studies, more recently that have found that autogynephilia is something that people do experience, whether it be women who are assigned female at birth can experience autogynephilia. Transgender women absolutely can experience it too. It is a thing that is out there. We'll come to that. But here, Blanchard is saying that all transgender women who are not attracted to men have autogynephilia as the root cause of their dysphoria. They're really basically paraphilic males. They're men with a problematic sexual proclivity in Blanchard's own kind of description, right? So that is really interesting. And it obviously had this huge impact, and continues to this day, right? The man who would be queen is absolutely drawing on Blanchard's original work and continues to find purchase in modern day. But hey, there are some really interesting critiques of this 1987 study that I think you're going to find fun. So Blanchard, in really fundamental ways, has quite a strong belief, I think, and it's evidenced in his writing here really, really clearly, that he thinks that transgender women lie. They minimize features of their histories. They don't tell the truth. And so he did a bunch of stuff to kind of compensate for that in the analysis, which is really interesting. So here's a direct quote. The classification criteria were intended to compensate for the marked tendency of male, in inverted commas, gender patients to minimize this feature of their histories. So they classified a patient as, in inverted commas, fetishistic, autogynephilic, if the transgender woman acknowledged such arousal in just one clinical interview, even if she stated that this reaction only occurred in puberty, or if she acknowledged such arousal in her response to just one of the 12 items of the EPES. That's the kind of the erotic preferences examination scheme, which basically mostly draws from the cross-gender fetishism scale, which is designed to kind of ask questions about, have you ever experienced kind of arousal when thinking about dressing as a woman, or when thinking about yourself with a female body or something like that. So they classed any person who said yes to any one item, or who indicated even once in any of the interviews that they experienced arousal in reference to thinking about themselves as a woman in some way, whether it be about how they dress or how they, their bodies or their voice or anything like that. And even if they are referencing what happened in adolescence, even if it no longer is something they experience, and even if they never experienced it even once as an adult, they were still put into the categorization of autogynephilic. So that is a wild decision to me for Blanchard to make. To categorize people in that way is wild to me. The other thing that Blanchard and his colleagues did in their original planned analysis, they found no clear pattern in their language of differences between the heterosexual and homosexual gender dysphorics. They found no clear pattern of differences between the two. Now, they thought that the true between-group differences might have been obscured, in their words, by the well-recognized tendency of applicants for sex reassignment surgery to distort their histories in the direction of classic transsexualism in an effort to gain approval. They assumed that participants were making things up, or at least obscuring the truth of their history, and so they conducted an additional data manipulation to reduce the effects of such distortion on between groups comparisons. And they reran a new analysis, adjusting the analysis to try to compensate for the fact they thought participants were essentially lying. That is absolutely bananas to me. I don't know. I'm speechless that those things occurred in this article. And of course, hey, the new analysis showed some between group differences are significant. How amazing is that? What a shocker. What a shocker. Now, in the follow-up work that has come after, I think people have landed on the idea, Julia Serrano's work, Lawrence's work, Lothstein, Sue, Moser quite a lot, and Veal and colleagues, they all seem to be kind of landing on the idea that autogynephilia is for sure a thing that people can experience, but that it's not necessarily a pathology. So I think this is most exemplified by Moser's 2009 study called Autogynephilia in Women in the Journal of Homosexuality. Now, they brought together female professional employees from an urban hospital in the States, and they've kind of disguised quite a lot about this sample because they didn't want to kind of reveal who these participants were. And And they basically asked them to complete a questionnaire about autogynephilia, either in the nurses' station or in the staff lounge on several different floors during either day or evening shifts. So it's pretty cool. This is good science in a sense, right? You go around, you just good old fashioned science. You go around with a clipboard and ask people to fill out a questionnaire. Brilliant. So in the end, they ended up with 29 completed questionnaires. The majority of folk were straight or heterosexual, about 90%. Nobody self-defined as gay or homosexual. 7% defined themselves as bi, and 3% didn't answer the question, which is interesting. That leaves 7% defined themselves as bi, and nobody defined themselves as gay, homosexual, which is super interesting to me. So the majority of them were in their 30s, essentially. Some in their 40s, some in their 18 to 29 range, and a handful in their 50s. And they basically asked these participants to complete a questionnaire about female autogynephilia. Now, the scale itself is sort of interesting to me. So here are the questions they asked. So they took the original autogynephilia scale from Blanchard and adapted it for women. So obviously it's no longer about like imagining yourself as a woman, right? Because these participants were assigned female at birth. So they've adapted the scale. I also think they made the scale a little bit more open. So they used slightly broader definitions, which I think might well be a criticism of the study. But you be the judge. So here's the questions. I've been erotically aroused by contemplating myself in the nude. I assume you're contemplating the self in the nude, not being nude while contemplating. I have been erotically aroused by contemplating myself wearing lingerie, underwear, or foundation garments, e.g. corsets. I have been erotically aroused by contemplating myself fully clothed in sexy attire. I've been erotically aroused by dressing in lingerie or sexy attire for a romantic evening or when hoping to meet a sex partner. I've been erotically aroused by preparing, shaving my legs, applying makeup, etc. for a romantic evening or when hoping to meet a sex partner. There's a couple of questions about masturbation, and there's I have been erotically aroused by imagining myself with a sexier body, and I've been erotically aroused by imagining that others find me particularly sexy, attractive, or irresistible. So these are a little bit broader, I think, and a little bit more generalizable than the autogynephilia ones, which do have a sort of slightly pathologizing tone to the questions, whereas these are certainly not that. But here, of these 29 participants, they had 35% who indicated that they responded frequently to at least one item. And there were only 2 responses who did not endorse any item, meaning that if these participants were drawn up in Blanchard's way, in the same way that they indicated endorsement of any single item here, then they'd have 93% of the participants at least who would be considered autogynephilic in some way, right? So that was the critique from Moser, was that, if we ask natal women, that's a terrible phrase, if we ask cisgender women about their experiences of like being aroused by the thought of themselves as sexual beings in the world, particularly if they think of themselves as attractive in some way, you actually find that a good number of women do that. Not everyone, and certainly not everyone to a great extent, but people do that. So it's kind of interesting that it might be found in the general population. Now, Bailey and Sue in 2022, there have been a few critiques of that article for obvious reasons. Like the measures are not really translatable to the autogynephilia scale. They did their best because autogynephilia scale is really pathologizing when you read it. So it's not surprising they amended it for a cisgender sample. But then it kind of does move away from autogynephilia conceptually. And so Bailey and Sue decided to take a look at how autogynephilic are natal females. That's the title of the study. They're really interested in how autogynephilic are natal females really. They conducted this in the archives of sexual behavior. They brought an absolutely stonking great sample together, 10 different samples of people, 148 from internet forums, So what they did basically, they got 4 samples of cisgender men or cross-dressers in some cases, sourced from various sources looking at autogynephilia. So either people browsing internet forums looking at autogynephilic interests, or internet forums related to autogynephilic fantasies. So they got 4 samples from there, equating to somewhere in the region of about just shy of 1,500 participants. That's pretty good. And then they got 4 samples together of just cisgender guys from various different places, from, MTurk, Amazon's participation station, from Prolific, from social media, from Qualtrics itself. And they brought together, there's about 350 participants in each. So somewhere in the region, about 1,400 participants from, just guys in the world who didn't consider themselves autogynephilic. You got to bear in mind, this is a kind of deliberate sample, right? But guys who absolutely do describe themselves as autogynephilic, and then you have a bunch of guys who don't. And then you have these 2 cisgender female samples, 203 folk from social media, and then 297 cisgender women from Prolific. Generally, participants averaged in their 30s, late 20s, and early 40s. That's just the average, but there's quite a range of ages in there. And then they took a look at the difference between the means, essentially, and then they took a look at the difference between the kind of histograms. How many people rated themselves at different levels of autogynephilia. Now, they did use the original autogynephilia scale, and they found something that's, I guess, what you would expect, right? They found that guys who considered themselves autogynephilic scored high on the autogynephilia scale. Guys who didn't consider themselves autogynephilic or weren't recruited from autogynephilia sources didn't consider themselves particularly autogynephilic, and that the women in the sample, the cisgender women who had been recruited, again, not from sources to do with autogynephilia, didn't consider themselves, weren't autogynephilic on the autogynephilia scale. So you take a look at the means, while women who are cisgender don't, on average, experience themselves to be particularly autogynephilic. They don't score very highly. In fact, they score about as high as the guys drawn from non-autogynephilic samples. I'm not absolutely certain what this is designed to prove, because, if you draw sources from places where, from autogynephilia forums, from, where people come together who have autogynephilic fantasy as something that they enjoy, then of course they are going to score high on the autogynephilia scale. I don't know what that was supposed to, sure. And then women who are drawn into the sample, cisgender women don't score particularly highly on autogynephilia, but they weren't drawn from autogynephilia forums. They weren't drawn from forums for that purpose, right? So I'm not absolutely certain what that was designed to prove. What is interesting is that there is a range of autogynephilia in all of these samples. So when you're looking at the cisgender guys who went to these sources of autogynephilia, right, these kind of forums, etc., you find they score quite highly, but even there, some folk don't score particularly highly on autogynephilia, right? Not super surprising. There's a sort of a long tail in the distribution towards the I don't feel particularly autogynephilic range. But in the sort of the cisgender male population of participants who don't consider themselves autogynephilic, even some of those guys did score highly on autogynephilia, right? It's just part of human diversity. There's a long tail in the sort of positive direction that, cisgender guys sometimes fantasize about dressing as girls. Hey, there's no, absolutely no shame in that. That's, it's a beautiful thing. And cisgender women then also show exactly the same tail. In fact, their tail is a little bit chunkier than the cisgender guys who weren't weren't drawn from autogynephilic sources. The cisgender girls, not drawn from autogynephilic sources, also had a pretty heavy tail of like quite a few people experienced a little bit of autogynephilia, not a lot, but some, and that tail extends. So quite, a fair few people still experience themselves to be very autogynephilic. The point is that the cisgender women and the cisgender men drawn from non-autogynephilia sources kind of reflected each other in a fairly significant way. Like they looked very similar to each other in their distribution. It's not as if cisgender women experience zero autogynephilia and cisgender men experience some. It's absolutely not the case. It looks like cisgender women experience it in the same way as cisgender guys do. Like it's simply a part of human sexual diversity. And far from being shameful, it's kind of great, I would say. So Moser kind of makes a really interesting point in their article in 2010. It's entitled Blanchard's Autogynephilic Theory, a Critique. And it's really interesting. They basically they describe that autogynephilia is a thing that people experience, but that it's sort of interesting and maybe not super helpful to bring together people who experience autogynephilia sometimes, like the thought of themselves as a woman might give them a little bit of sexual arousal, a little bit sometimes, or did in adolescence, because I don't know about you, but when I was an adolescent, a particularly curvy avocado would have made me aroused. But I think putting those folk together who have like maybe a history of that in adolescence, or who experience it rarely, with people who have it consistently and for whom they experience it to be a problem, is not necessarily a helpful thing to do. And Moser kind of says, listen, this isn't necessarily something that is a negative thing. That people who have like time limited histories of a little bit of autogynephilic arousal and maybe experience it from time to time now, and it isn't a problem for them. That's not a bad thing for people to experience, and it doesn't necessarily invalidate their identities. But for people who experience it more consistently and for whom they experience it problematically, then that might be something that warrants some help and support, and for whom they might need a little bit of help. Now, Anne Lawrence, I think, puts this in pretty interesting terms. So Anne Lawrence wrote a book in 2013 called Men Trapped in Men's Bodies, Narratives of Autogynephilic Transsexualism. And that book has actually had a bunch of scientific reviews. Probably the most interesting is by Lothstein in 2013, Controversy at Ground Zero, Transsexualism as Female Essence in Male Paraphilia? ? Human right or something to be treated. It's just a really interesting kind of review. And there's a few quotes from Lawrence's book that feature in this review that I think are really helpful to draw forward. Now, full disclosure, I haven't read the whole book. I find it actually quite challenging to read, not just because there's a lot of stories of autogynephilia. Essentially, it gets a little bit repetitive, and it's also quite stark and a little bit difficult to read at times, if I'm honest. So I'm not super gonna read the whole of that book, but these quotes are really revelatory. And it does identify that maybe there are folk in here who might need a little help, not just with gender dysphoria, but with, an autogynephilia being something that they're really struggling with. So here's a good quote. I am not delighted by what the theory tells me about myself, and I doubt that I will ever be, says Lawrence. I still feel deeply ashamed, not just about being a transsexual, which is shameful enough, but about being an autogynephilic transsexual, which feels more shameful still. That's from page 203. And she reiterates that the theory she adheres to, in inverted commas, tells us we have no internal female essence, and our desire to be a woman stems from our paraphilic male sexuality. Now, I think this is where Lawrence kind of diverges from my view here, and I think probably from the view of people I greatly respect. There's a beautiful review from Julia Serrano in 2020, Autogynephilia, a Scientific Review, Feminist Analysis, and Alternative Embodiment Fantasies Model, the Sociological Review, she published in. It's stunning. It's a really nice piece of work. And if you're only going to read, if you desperately want to read about autogynephilia, then go read Serrano's work. It's a really thoughtful, reflective piece, diving deep into the concept and its challenges, basically. Now, Lawrence, though, I think highlights something that's really important to say, is that there are people out here for whom autogynephilia is a big part of their lives and arguably problematic in their lives. Like, if they experience it for themselves to be problematic, then they might need help with it and should have access to that help. But the problem is where Lawrence goes one step further and suggests that it is the reason for gender dysphoria. Now, I don't see any evidence for that. It might be the case that it's the reason for some people, but I don't think it's the case for everyone. And I don't think it's even the case in the majority of cases. And I think to consider that what makes us the gender that we are is derived from something paraphilic, derived from like a problematic aspect of our sexuality, I think misrepresents gender identity, and I think creates a bit of a danger that people might think that the way to solve this problem is to treat a paraphilia, and therefore we could prevent people from being transgender, which I definitely don't think is the case at all. We've already looked at the conversion therapy literature to show that A, it doesn't work, and B, that it is deeply, deeply damaging to people who experience it. So I very much don't think that this theory is a good theory to use in any kind of public policy. I don't think there's any real evidence for it. I do think there is evidence, however, for autogynephilia. I think that people do experience it, and it's not necessarily a problem unless people experience it to be one, and then they should have access to the treatments that they need. Lawrence says of sex reassignment specifically is arguably the treatment of choice for some intensely gender dysphoric autogynephilic adults. And she goes on to say that she's painted a rather grim picture of autogynephilic transsexualism overall, although sex reassignment surgery is often the best solution to our problem and sometimes a life-saving one, it's a mediocre solution at best. She says, our efforts to create the kind of bodies we want to live in are painful, expensive, and unsatisfactory. We often suffer terrible losses when we undergo sex reassignment surgery and live as women. Once we have done so, we will never again live normal lives. From page 217. I want to say that I feel a great deal for Lawrence in her writing here. I really, really genuinely do. I'm sorry that that's the experience that she has had. When we've taken a look at the literature, we've taken a look at both gender dysphoria literature and gender euphoria literature. And we have found that actually, I don't know that this is often the case, right? That people, I'm sure it is, that sometimes that people land in unsatisfactory places and feel like they can't live normal lives. And certainly our lives on the other side of this aren't, aren't typical, not always. That guy outside the bar, would I have kissed him if I was, fully, if I didn't experience myself to be like, if I wasn't worried about being clocked, would I have kissed him? I mean, maybe. So maybe she's right. Maybe we don't live fully typical lives, but we also experience a great deal of euphoria and joy in the world. Gender euphoria, trans joy is a real thing. And I really, looking at the literature, more and more people are experiencing that euphoria. And I really feel for Lawrence. It clearly has not been something that she has experienced, at least not in this book. Now, I want to end on Julia Serrano's work in 2020, Autogynephilia, Scientific Review, a Feminist Analysis and Alternative Embodiment Fantasies Model. The reason why I want to land on it, a lot of the things that we've talked about here, Julia talks about it better in her article, frankly. She's a beautiful writer, and I like that her work is finding its way into people's hands. It's only fairly recent, 2020, and it's gorgeous. It's a really interesting critical review. But she also comes up with a separate idea, this alternative model, embodiment fantasies. She says this: taking all this together, two things seem clear. First, embodiment fantasies, i.e. arousal in response to one's real or imagined body and or expressions of gender, seem to be fairly common and exist in a variety of permutations. This is why I favour embodiment fantasies as a non-pathologizing umbrella term for those sexual fantasies and patterns of arousal, wherein the focus is mostly, or in some cases solely, placed on our own embodiment. Serrano puts this in a broader cultural context too. She says that male to female, particularly male to female spectrum people, are highly sexualized in our culture, not only in all kinds of television shows and movies where characters are often and experiences are portrayed in, in sexual contexts and perhaps even lurid fashions. And they're seen as often like sexually deviant or sexually motivated in their transitions, and that kind of autogynephilia in the scientific community is a sort of scientific reflection of that cultural trend to see trans people as fundamentally sexual. And it's also wild that we're also seen as non-sexual in a number of other ways, but we'll get into that in another episode. But the trans folk are considered to be fundamentally driven by sexual motives or are, perverse in their kind of sexuality is often something that's kind of targeted towards trans people. And in this kind of scientific sphere, I have to say that the way in which we're described and the theories that are being used to describe us feels very targeted. Like, I gotta say that in the original work from Blanchard, reading it, the tone of the work is so like the consistent claim that transgender women lie and make things up, that we disguise our histories without any kind of understanding of the medical context in which that has become necessary in the 80s in order to access transition, which was awfully difficult to access generally. And any sense that transgender women weren't typical transgender women would be a reason not to give them access to transition-related services. So this kind of concept of, transgender people lie, and then the decisions taken in the research to attend to the assumption that they are not telling the whole truth in the research, all of that just, it comes down, and in the tone of the conclusion of the work, it's so deeply pathologizing and discriminatory in, I think, in the way that it describes transgender women. In fundamental terms, describes transgender women as fundamentally men, which is, always good fun to read. Serrano concludes really beautifully. She says that autogynephilia as a way of thinking about the root causes of transgender folks' experience and as a way of categorizing them seems to have little merit. She says, for this reason, and because its terminology is especially maligning to male to female spectrum people, it's recommended that autogynephilia theory and the language associated with it should be avoided in favor of more accurate and less stigmatizing terminology. Like all human beings, she says, this is gorgeous, male to female spectrum people have rich and diverse fantasy lives. Future studies that seek to understand the phenomena of cross-gender arousal or female-feminine embodiment fantasies should be conducted in a manner that is respectful of this diversity, differential to what male to female spectrum individuals say about their own experiences, and careful not to needlessly exacerbate the non-consensual sexualization that this population already faces in society. Sexuality is a broad church, and it's kind of beautiful. So I think what we need to do in the research is absolutely to consider female embodiment fantasies as part of sexual experiences and fantasy. And I think that is worthy of further research, but we shouldn't use it as an opportunity to consider that transgender people are always autogynephilic, or that their autogynephilia always and necessarily causes their transgender experience, is at the root of their transgender experience, or that those experiences of female embodiment fantasies are necessarily a paraphilia, that they're necessarily problematic or pathological. That actually, this is kind of beautiful, and maybe we should explore it in a kind of respectful and considerate way that empowers people to talk about and de-shame these experiences rather than stigmatize them. Thanks so very, very much for joining me. You are very welcome here. And hey, together, let's make a world where everyone can engage in consensual sexual relationships that make them feel satisfied and happy in the world. And maybe also make a world where everyone can find a place to belong. Hey, for sure. Wonderful to see you as always. And I look forward to seeing you as always in the next one.